Right, good morning again. Great to see you all. Right, we're now going to cover the period of the 1850s or so through to 1900, and this could be called the Great Age of Great Age of Victorian Exploration. So in around 1850, already some countries were starting to annex land in Africa. It's only in the 1870s that the real great scramble occurred, but it already started, and partly because of all these explorers penetrating deeper and deeper into Africa. And of course, as you know, the most famous of all of these is David Livingstone. And he does have a part to play in the story about finding weavers. Oops. So, as you know, David Livingstone came from Scotland. He came to South Africa with the London Missionary Society, and he started exploring northwards. He is, of course, best known for his anti-slavery campaign, as well as just opening up and discovering many geographical features in Africa. Now, unlike a lot of the other earlier explorers who all went out with ox wagons, certainly he did have ox wagons and expeditions at times, but he's unique in often having just walking with a few porters. He'd have animals with as well to carry some of the luggage and so on, but he really believed in traveling light, and he was able to go places more easily by traveling so light. And it's been estimated that he walked something like 46,000 kilometers. I just can't imagine that. I walk a lot, but it's not ever going to be close to that. Right, and one of the most famous discoveries was being the first European to see the Victoria Falls, which was on the 16th of November, 1855. And this was very significant for David Livingstone because he was looking for trade routes into Africa, partly for trade, but partly to combat slavery. And he knew that this was part of the Zambezi River because the outlet in Mozambique was known, and it had to be this river. But he made it his aim to start in Mozambique and explore the Zambezi River upstream, and he believed that it would open up a way of navigation, being able to go by ship. Unfortunately, that didn't happen, but certainly over these years in the 1850s and early 1860s, he had planned this expedition, his second Zambezi expedition, and he had this paddle steamer, which he named after his wife, Mary, Ma Robert, and he had a whole team of people with him, one being Dr. John Kirk, who was a doctor as well as very interested in wildlife. And so he came as a doctor, but he also collected specimens on their journey. So whenever they stopped off on the banks of the river to overnight, he would go off exploring. So they started off over here and travelled up, and of course there's a dam there now that didn't exist then, but there were rapids. And these Kahora Bassa Falls were just too much for his boat. They walked and tried to find a way to carry things around, but it was just too far. And he waited even to see if when the water level dropped or rose, if that would make a difference. But eventually he just had to give up and not realize his dream of being able to sail or travel by boat all the way up. You can see how far the Zambezi extends. So what he did was he backtracked and he went up, which he had seen before, the Shire River, although I believe it's pronounced Cherie or something like that. And he's the first European again to have travelled up here. And reached Lake Malawi, so coming up here, and explored the shores of Lake Malawi before returning south. And it's at one of these points somewhere on this expedition that he said, one of his famous quotes, "I'm prepared to go anywhere as long as it's forward." So even though he had been turned back by the Zambezi, he still carried going forward in a different direction. Now, what happened is, on his return, he got stuck here. It was just the rainy season had been some months earlier. The water level was dropping, and so it was fine on the way up, but on the way down, the water level had dropped enough that they were stuck in the Elephant Marsh. This is just a fancy painting, but of course there were reeds. The water level was lower on the way down. Maybe this was painted on the way up, I'm not sure. But they had to wait 2 months before the water level rose again. And in those 2 months, John Kirk had a field day exploring and collecting birds and different animals, and he wrote some papers on everything that he collected. And one of the birds was this weaver bird, southern brown-throated weaver. He didn't provide a name for it, so he sent it off to, in this case, it ended up in Germany, where it was described by Hartlaub and co-authors. But it's not surprising that he found the southern brown-throated weaver in this area. This is approximately where it was found, and this bird is interesting in that it's very much a wetland species. So you get it in the river outlets, estuaries along KwaZulu-Natal, southern Mozambique, a different subspecies in the Okavango swamps, and then over here in Malawi you get the type subspecies which was first found. They virtually only ever build their nests in reeds, as you can see over here. There's a young bird sitting on top of the nest, fledging. That nest has fallen over from the reed. There's always a danger with building nests for weavers and reeds that a reed might break. And I have often put the main stem back and tied it with a stick to, if there are chicks, small chicks in the nest, to try and help the weavers. But it's all just part of the natural cycle. So when eventually they did manage to continue the journey back to the coast, Shupunga in Mozambique is one of the bases where Livingstone always stopped off. There was a village there where they could get supplies from the locals and things like that. And also, very tragically, on this expedition, his wife, Mary, had come along. In many of his earlier expeditions, she had just stayed at the mission station with Moffat and Kuruman area. So she was buried here. She died of malaria. And while they were there, again, John Kirk was exploring the area, and he was just looking at some weaver nests and putting his hand in to see if there were any chicks or eggs or something. And he was very surprised when, from one of them, he took out a small bat. And these woolly bats, you can see the picture there, they're incredibly small, so it's very easy for them to fly into a weaver nest and roost there during the day. And he says that, he writes in his paper, that he then went and searched as many nests as possible, not just for the weavers, but also looking for these bats, and he found 4 more specimens, which he then, they were alive, but he took them as specimens, and it was a new subspecies of this Damara woolly bat. This map just shows other places where these bats have also been found in roosting in weaverbird nests. And here in Zululand is a record by the well-known Austin Roberts, who wrote the first field guide for, or major field guide for Southern Africa. And he was also exploring and collecting mammals and birds, but he saw a spectacled weaver nest, which looked like he suspected the breeding season had passed, and so he just nipped it off at the top and thought it would be a very nice nest for the Transvaal Museum collection, and he packed it in his box, and when the collecting trip of a week or two was completed. This was in 1924 or so. He went back to Pretoria, and it was only one evening when his assistant opened this box to take the nests and specimens out, that out flew this bat. And because it was inside the museum, they could catch it, but so he was quite surprised to find that. Of course, Austin Roberts was very interested in mammals as well as birds, and also wrote a massive handbook on the mammals of southern Africa. Right, so Livingstone played this very small part in taking John Kirk along, who found the southern brown-throated weaver, but Livingstone's legacy is still as one of the greatest explorers in Africa and maybe even globally. Unfortunately, he had many failings, especially as a leader. Family was neglected a lot of the time, but in spite of his weaknesses, he's still regarded as one of the foremost explorers. He found, in addition to Lake Victoria, Lake Malawi, sorry, not Lake Victoria, Victoria Falls, Lake Malawi, also Lake Ngami, so as well as lots of other places. He was the first white person to find. He also has many place names are named after him. So, of course, Livingstone, the town in Zambia, as well as there's a Livingstonia in Malawi, and there's a list of about 100 places, schools, villages, all sorts of things named after Livingstone. And, of course, he inspired many abolitionists back in the UK to fight against slavery, and he's inspired many other explorers, even as recently in our day, Kingsley Holgate considers Livingstone one of his heroes. So, Livingstone helped open up Africa, but the one other thing that Livingstone was interested in was finding the source of the Nile. But he was working too far south, and so he proposed, when he hit the end of the Congo River, that could be it. But no one at that stage took him seriously, just because there were already other contenders exploring in East Africa. And this book by Tim Gill was written in 2001, and the very first sentence of the book is, "In the middle of the 19th century, the whereabouts of the Nile's source was still the planet's most elusive secret, as it had been since the days of the pharaohs." Now, why was this so important? And part of the reason is that, the Europeans knew about the Nile in Egypt. Egypt and North African countries were very well known, long before Roman times even. And so they knew that this river flowed into the Mediterranean, even though Egypt is such an arid country. You've got the Sahara Desert, one of the biggest and most arid deserts in the world. And yet this river just keeps flowing, flooding at the wrong time of year, because of course the water comes from so far away. And there was concern. What if something happened to the source of the Nile, and where is it? And with this 1800s being this age of exploration, it became a very important question. And the Royal Geographic Society in England provided lots of sponsorship to explorers to actually find the source of the Nile. But even before that, even in the days of the Romans, so they're just showing again, how green it is just right around the Nile, but then you've got this arid desert there, as you can see in the photo as well. And the Romans had sent an expedition to go upstream along the Nile, but they only managed to get up to South Sudan, and that's where a lot of other travelers ended up stopping as well, those who came from Egypt, because of this vast wetland area with reeds, and just too difficult to get through with boats and or by land. So then in the 1700s, James Bruce, and he is part of the Weaver story, although I could have spoken about him in the first lecture. He decided, he was based in Ethiopia mainly, but he decided to explore the Blue Nile, this branch, and he got right up to the source high up in the Ethiopian mountains. He claimed in his travel books to be the first European to have reached the source of the Blue Nile, but that's of course not true. There were people before him that managed to get there. But anyway, while he was working there, he did find the Black Ploceus weaver, and he sent it off to France to be described, and it is a really interesting weaver bird. The species was later found to have all these various plumages, and at the time, of course, people were describing each one as a different species, but later on taxonomists like James Chapin and others merged them and said, no, they're too similar, they should be one species. But here you can see that there's a yellow-crowned group, at least in one of the pair. So the male here has got the yellow crown, even though the female doesn't. Here, both male and female have the yellow crown. And then you also have the black crown, where both male and female generally have the black crown. But again, not always. So incredible variation between the sexes, between these different groups. The young birds are also slightly different, so it makes it very confusing. And this is where James Bruce would have collected in Ethiopia. Here's the type specimen for this species. And here are just some more examples of the different subspecies. I've ringed these in Kenya, the common subspecies over there. But the common features are that they all have a yellow eye, pale eye, and black face, which can be the whole head or just around the eye, and yellow or green wing edgings over there. So people generally manage to identify Black Ploceus weaver quite easily just through its jizz, just the way it looks and behaves and so on. It's also very interesting in that, unlike other weavers, it does not build its nests at the end of the twigs, but underneath. So this is a photograph looking from below, and they really like hiding their nests under leaves or branches, probably to avoid predation. Usually it's small colonies with one pair, but several nests from previous seasons, also to make it harder for predators to know which is the actual active nest. But there still is predation. A colleague of mine a year or two ago sent me this photo of a vervet monkey in Kenya. He saw it ripping off a nest and taking out the chicks and eating them. The monkey had actually ripped off several nests till he found the one with chicks. All right, then the main character in finding the source of the Nile is John Speke, and he was based in the British Indian Army, so he was in India, but he explored through Saudi Arabia, and he was very interested in exploring Somaliland. And his first attempt was refused by the authorities in Somaliland. They said, no, it's too dangerous. But then came along Richard Burton, who was already well known in the British, to the British as an explorer, and he had already got funding and permission to do a trip in Somaliland, and so Speke asked if he could join. They parted ways, so they started off at the coast and went off, and Burton went one way and Speke continued along here, and this is approximately as far as he got before returning. And when he was there, he found what was later called Speke's weaver. Now he thought that he just called it a bio weaver because he had been based in India. The bio weaver is the most common weaver species there, and it does look similar superficially. And he wrote about this in his diary, saying, I found this little bio bird on the plateau in considerable numbers, feeding where there were long grasses and plants and flower. So because of his contact with India, he sent it off to an ornithologist, Blythe, who described it as a with a different name, but related to the bioweaver. But that was later found to be an invalid name, and much later, Hugelin, who also collected this species, gave it the name Ploceus speeki in honor of Speke, who had first collected it. And you can see that is this is where Speke had been on his first trip in Africa. Burton and Speke then decided to continue their exploration for searching for the source of the Nile, starting down here from Zanzibar, and they got funding again from the Royal Geographic Society. Oh, sorry, I'm just going to give you a bit of background about Speke's weaver before I continue with the history part. Speke's weaver has got these dense colonies of nests. You can see these just lots and lots of nests here. Although in Somaliland they are small colonies, in Kenya they're much bigger colonies, and you even get these colonies in Nairobi. But you have to be careful because you also get lots of village weavers in Nairobi, and so, but it's easy to tell them apart by just the entrance tube always being much bigger and the nests being much more densely packed than village weavers. So the birds also look fairly similar, although the village weaver's got black extending over the crown in the subspecies in East Africa and a red eye. Oh yes, and I nearly forgot about this. This was still when they were in, Burton and Speke were in Somaliland. They had joined again. Speke had all his collections of birds, and the one night they were attacked by locals. And Speke was still in his tent, and he just opened the flap to look out, and Burton shouted out, who had already left his tent. He just didn't see what Speke was doing, and he thought Speke was trying to run away because he had just opened and was looking out. He says, "Come on, man, I mean, get into the battle." And Speke certainly did then. They both were wounded. Burton was speared in the eye, or in his face, his jaw. But since then, Burton still thought that Speke had tried to hide, whereas he was only just waking up and coming out. And since then, they were always bitter enemies, in spite of the fact that they traveled together. I mean, they were a team with, of course, many other people, and it had tragic consequences later on in their story. Anyway, so eventually, they started from Zanzibar on this one trip, and they got to some point south of Lake Victoria when Burton fell very ill. I don't remember if it was malaria or not, but or dysentery or something like that, but he just couldn't continue. So Speke said, well, he'll just explore the area a bit and continue. He went north for a few days' journey and was amazed when he crested the top of a hill and he just saw Lake Victoria in front of him. He just knew, that was August 1858, that this was the source of the Nile. And he was absolutely convinced of that. He went back to Burton, and when Burton had recovered, they, I think because of time, couldn't go back to Lake Victoria immediately, but went back to announce their discovery to the world. Now, Burton, of course, was very jealous, and he once they were back in England, started making all sorts of counterclaims, and the rivalry between them just increased. He said that, of course, Speke was wrong. It wasn't the source of the Nile, and he was correct in that Speke had not gone right around Lake Victoria to see that it did exit into the Nile River. It was just an assumption. Of course, he was correct. But it was only later explorers that actually circumnavigated the lake to determine it as the real source of the Nile. Burton and Speke had then planned a big debate at the Royal Geographic Society offices in London, so it was set on one of their monthly dates, and it attracted a lot of attention. But unfortunately, some days before the meeting, Speke was out hunting on his estate, and no one else was with him, so it's very vague on what happened, but it's suspected that when he was jumping over a small fence, his rifle discharged into his face, and of course he was instantly killed. So some people said at the time, he committed suicide because he was too afraid to have this debate. But that clearly was not the case. But now also he couldn't defend himself. And so for a long time, Burton took the credit for having found Lake Victoria. Of course, he was the expedition leader, so one can look at this in different ways, but he certainly went to great lengths to discredit Speke. And it's only when Tim Gill wrote this book, Explorers of the Nile, that I mentioned earlier, that he tried to paint a more accurate picture, pointing out both weaknesses in both men, but just a really excellent book to read on the whole history of this saga. Right, so Lake Victoria had been found, but there was still lots of exploration to be done, and one of the things, in fact, that also had to be done was to find a better route. It's fine getting to Lake Victoria, but to find a most convenient route, and that's what a lot of other explorers did in the few years following. But Emin Pasha falls into this exploration story in a different way. He became governor of Equatoria, that's the north part of Uganda, southern part of Sudan, and he was an incredibly avid collector of birds. He sent hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of birds back to Germany because of his German origin, where Hartlaub and other well-known, Reichenau and other well-known authors described species after species that he had sent. So he collected 3 weaverbird species in addition to many other birds, and one of the first of the weavers was the cardinal quelea. And he also had diaries that he kept and wrote about the birds. He enjoyed writing about the habits of the birds. So, for instance, for the cardinal quelea, that water was important. They drank in the mornings and evenings. Their food was insects and grass seeds. And he also found their nesting colonies and looked at the eggs, and I assume sent back eggs to Germany as well. There are 3 quelea species, and the red-headed and cardinal quelea are fairly similar, although the red in the cardinal quelea extends much further down. But the females of these 2 species are virtually impossible to tell apart in the field. They're also a similar size and so on. But the males are fairly distinctive in breeding plumage. And then the third quelea species, red-billed quelea, described by Linnaeus, right, one of the earliest weavers to be described, as you heard on Monday. So Emin Pasha, in addition to the cardinal quelea, also described the slender-billed weaver and northern brown-throated weaver, birds that are extremely common around Lake Victoria, and I've managed to catch and ring and study these species around there. Now, at one point, similar to the story, I didn't tell you about Livingstone and Stanley because everyone knows that story, but interestingly enough, at one point, I apologize for not, I think it's the Arabs, but they were driving Emin Pasha further south, so there was conflict in the region that he was governing, and there was no news from him in England. England was now, of course, very interested in this whole region just because it had been made so famous by actually finding the source of the Nile and the mountains of the moon, the Ruwenzori Mountains and so on. And so eventually Henry Morton Stanley was commissioned to actually find Emin Pasha in the same way that some years earlier he had been sent to find Livingstone. And he decided, strangely enough, to follow the Congo River from the western side of Africa all the way across Africa. So it was also an exploration trip. He also had difficulty in getting funding from England, even though they were keen on him doing this. So he actually got funding from the Belgian government, and they had their eye on what became Belgian Congo. And so they already had their bases near the coast, but they wanted him to explore further along the Congo River. And he eventually did find Emin Pasha, who did not want to be rescued or found, but reluctantly he went with Stanley all the way to the East African coast, but then he soon after went back, where unfortunately he was killed by some local tribes. But in exploring and opening up the Congo, although he wasn't the first, just before him, Friedrich Borndorf and in a whole expedition set up by Austrians and Hungarians had also taken a boat up the Congo River, where this guy, Borndorf, also a German naturalist, collected a lot of specimens, including the bob-tailed weaver. So they, whoops, sorry, just go back. They were probably, they must have been near the end of their expedition when Stanley started his expedition. Right. So that's as much as I'm going to say about East African explorers in terms of searching for the Nile source. In South Africa, there was this Swedish naturalist that you may have heard of, Johann August Wahlberg. He was a hunter, and his diary was published in recent years in the Van Riebeck series, and it makes fascinating reading, although also very depressing. And it's a reflection on many of the hunters in those days, unfortunately, that they were after these trophies, and they sometimes described when animals were wounded, just what suffering they went through, the noises they made, and so on. And it didn't seem to bother them at all, largely in those days. Unfortunately, one elephant took his revenge. He had wounded the elephant and lost sight of it in the reeds in the Okavango area, and it came out and trampled him. But some 10 years or so before his death, he was in northwest province of South Africa, where he found the red-headed weaver, where it's still very common in that area in large colonies often. He sent all his bird specimens, including this red-headed weaver, back to Sweden, to Sandoval, who described many, many birds, new birds that Wahlberg had found. Now, and you can see here, this specimen I photographed in the Berlin Museum. There are several specimens, some still in Sweden, but some had been sold off to Berlin Museum. As you can see, his name is written there. The red-headed weaver is an interesting story in that, so although this was in 1850, it had been collected in 1843, but it took a few years to get to Sweden and be described. But a French guy, Lefresnay, had already collected it in 1839 in Senegal, and he named it Ploceus melanotus. But he didn't know, he didn't do his homework, but of course it was very difficult in those days to have all the literature available, that Swainson had already given this name to the little weaver. That's no longer, that's just a synonym nowadays of little weaver. But it means that according to the rules of nomenclature, it's an invalid name. And so Lefresnay is not credited with being the author of the red-headed weaver. It is, however, still the subspecies. So it's Anaplectus rubriceps melanotus for this North African race. It occurs across Senegal to East Africa, and it's got a black mask, not that clear in this photograph, whereas the South African birds are completely red in the males on the head in breeding season. And here you see, this is the southern subspecies, red-headed weaver. The female is yellowish, so quite a bit less bright than the male. The red-headed weaver builds an incredibly strong nest. They use twigs and tendrils, or leaf tendrils, and these dry out and make a really strong nest, incredibly difficult to pull apart. The other true weavers build nests of grass, green grass, which dry out, but those you can fairly easily rip apart. And so even for predators like gymnogenes, it's quite hard for them to access these nests. And as a consequence, they're used by many other bird species. I've mentioned this before, but the red-headed weaver is the weaver that attracts the greatest diversity of other finches and other birds using their nests. And it's not surprising because they've got such amazing, strong nests. So here's a photo, this is taken by a colleague, Megan Lofty-Eaton, of a cutthroat finch. It's a chick. This is looking from the bottom up into the chamber, and the chick is looking out. So it's over there waiting for it to be fed by its own parent. These aren't brood parasites, so the finches are taking over nests that the weavers aren't using, often while the weavers are still busy. I found a red-headed weaver nest near Pretoria where cutthroat finches were flying in the nest and the red-headed weavers were trying to chase them away, but they're so persistent, they just keep coming back, they just don't give up. And eventually the weavers just let them breed in one of the nests, and the weavers carry on nesting in the other nests. Again, red-headed weavers often have several nests from previous seasons, so there's lots of old nests available anyway. So, as I said, that's the cutthroat finch. The interesting thing is that the cutthroat finch has got got a parasite, the video finches. For instance, what's the name now? Audience, help me. The black widow finch. But I don't know which one it is. One of them will lay its eggs in their nests. They do build their own nests, but they often just take over weaverbird nests. But if a widow bird finch's egg is laid in here, the chicks have the same mouth markings. So the parent finch won't know, and it will actually feed all the chicks. Not like the cuckoos that throw out the other chicks or eggs. They raise together. Then also blue waxbill, here's an adult, probably laying eggs or sitting on eggs, but just in the entrance, going in and out of a red-headed weaver nest. And here, these, not so easy to see, but these are cutthroat finches roosting. I took that photograph at night with a flash, but they were sleeping in the red-headed weaver nest over there. So there's a whole range of other finches that often also take over the red-headed weaver's nests to breed or to roost in. There are quite a few weavers that have got a long entrance tube, and especially many in the Malimba species in West Africa, but in South Africa there are only 3 species. And one can tell them apart. Sometimes it's difficult, but dark-backed weaver, mostly they build, if you look side on, the entrance is built at a slight angle, not directly down as in these 2 species. So it's usually at a slight angle. I mean, there can be exceptions. Also, it's built of creepers and tendrils and forest environments, but totally different plant material to what the red-headed weaver nest is composed of. But these can also become fairly strong, although not as strong as the red-headed weaver nests. Spectacled weavers build their nests of grass, so predators can tear them open fairly easily, but they do have long entrance tubes. And there's even a nest in the museum in East London that's, I haven't seen it, I haven't been there, but apparently it's about 1.5 meters long, so incredibly long. I mean, it must have been quite high up in the tree. Right, then I'm going to talk a little bit about Angola. Angola has surprisingly an incredibly large diversity of bird species, different habitats. And there's this Portuguese explorer, Anchieti, and he moved to Angola. He established a laboratory in the ruins of a church, and that's where he kept all his specimens. He just went out on these. So he was paid by the Portuguese government as a naturalist, but people suspect that they also wanted information from him on the local tribes and what was happening in the region there where he was based, in the sort of like central south of Angola, Kakonda area. He collected 4 weaverbird species. These are the 4: bar-winged weaver, marsh widowbird, Bocage's weaver, and black-chinned weaver. Bocage's weaver is very similar to Cape weaver that we have here in Cape Town and the rest of South Africa, and it was considered one species for a long time. And you can see that it's got a bit of a green face mask, and I see that in Cape weavers every now and then, that it's a greenish patch, other times more orange, other times yellow. So it varies a lot more in the Cape weaver, whereas Bocage's weaver, it's yellowish or greenish. I'm going to talk about two of these weavers, biology briefly. The bar-winged weaver is a really interesting bird. So this is where Anchieti collected it. It occurs in the Miombo woodlands in Angola and Zambia, and it builds this nest of usnia. And there are a few other birds that do that as well, and especially the olive-headed weaver. Over there, also builds a nest of usnia. But the interesting thing is that all these weavers, they're not genetically closely related. I mean, other than that they're weavers, they're not like one group of very close relatives, but they are ecologically very unique. Other than the general seed eaters that most weavers are, and there's some insect eaters, but the way they obtain their insect food is by moving along branches and trees and digging for insects under the bark. So it's very different to even the normal insect-eating weavers like spectacled weaver that just forage on leaves for exposed insects, spiders, and so on. These birds actually look under the bark and move along twigs and branches. So a very unique group, this whole bunch of weavers. And then black-chinned weaver, I'll talk a bit about that, the other bird that Anchieti collected. Anchieti sent all of his specimens to Portugal, where there was an ornithologist, Bocage, who described them. So Bocage's weaver was later actually named by Reichenau in honor of Bocage. So he did most of the weavers, but occasionally he made errors as well. So he also used an invalid name for this species, and so it was much later described in 1904 by Reichenau with the current name. But this is a very rare weaver as well, and I visited Angola a few years ago to study the specimens there. And you can see the male and female. This is the female, this is the male, in their collection. And then in 2013, the guy, Michael Mills, who organized our trip to study these specimens in Angola, was traveling in northern Angola when he found the first nests of black-chinned weaver. And he asked me to help write it up. So I didn't see them myself, unfortunately, but he took these photographs and we wrote up the description of these nests. There's one other weaver bird that also for decades and decades did not have its nest described, and that was the Clark's weaver in Kenya. But in 2014, the first nests were found. So it's amazing to think that weavers are such common birds in general, but there are some that are much rarer, and of course those sometimes build their nests in very difficult to find places. And it's taken that long that even in modern days there are nests of birds that are not known. There's still a few other bird species in the world where the nest is not known, but that list is decreasing very rapidly as people find the nests and describe them. Right, and then getting close to the end of today's lecture, Richard Sharp described many weavers as well. He was working at the British Museum, and so of course had hundreds and hundreds, if not thousands, of specimens arriving annually, and he decided to catalogue everything in the British Museum in the late 1800s. And it took him 27 volumes to catalogue everything that was in the collection at the time. And in the process, of course, he discovered that there were some new species, including 7 weaver bird species. But the interesting thing is that at this time in Europe, so the late 1800s, there were 3 museums that were of incredible prominence, the one in Paris, the one in Berlin, and the British Museum. And as you remember from our earlier talks, in the early 1700s, there were wealthy people who had these amassed collections because they could afford to buy specimens coming from all over the world. But things changed over time, and it just wasn't worth it for people to keep these massive collections, try and compete and have more specimens than anyone else. And slowly, these collections made their ways into museums that were being established. And these museums grew rapidly, with all these private collections being donated or sold, as well as people actually starting to send specimens to museums specifically rather than to private collectors. There's also a lot of exchanges going on between museums, and so that's why, as I'd mentioned before, a lot of African birds ended up even in America. Right, and so this, for weavers, was the most productive time. And just in terms of that question yesterday, why more weavers relative to other birds collected in that same time period, I need to look at it at quite a bit more. But what I did do last night is I took a summary of all weavers that have been described, so not only those that are valid species today. So the red line is those that are valid species today. The blue line, all species, bird species, and this green line, all the weavers that have ever been described. Of course, it's scaled differently. I haven't included the scale, but just to show the general pattern. And if you look at that, you see that it's not as prominent. If you look at, of course, many of those are invalid. But so what it suggests is that a lot of the weavers that were described in this time were actually valid species. But it just reinforces the point of what I said yesterday, that it's actually finding these very rare weavers deep in the Congo forests, even in Angola and places like that. I do need to look at that a bit more to delve in more and figure it out, why there is this massive peak. But I'm sure it's to do something with just the fact that there just was, just by chance, more rare weavers than globally birds were being described. So, yeah, that's the lecture for today, and I'm happy to take any questions. Right. Yes, Barry. This topic I read up a lot on when I was doing this Weaver Wednesday series on discovery. That's 2014, so that's a while ago. And the amazing thing is, over the years, I have read Burchell's diary, Andrew Smith's diary, Sparman, just about anything that's available in the UCT library on these early collectors that had something to do with birds, I have read. But it's a while ago. But certainly, there's a fine gunshot that's the best for small birds. They did use larger calibers for shooting larger birds, bustards and things like that. But the important thing is to not damage the specimen if you're collecting not for food but for preserving a skin. So it is a very fine shot, gunshot. Can't think of the word. Sorry, what? Yes, certainly lead pellets, yeah. That are used. And of course, still what happened is many specimens were damaged. I mean, just if the main, even if these fine pellets hitting it mainly on the head, it could damage the head. And so many specimens were just discarded as no good to send back to anyone. There has been a criticism, especially by the general public, on, wow, all these people collecting birds and animals, wouldn't that affect the conservation of these species? And actually, there's a lady, Barbara Mearns, who's written a book on the early collectors, very much with a British focus, but also a global interest. And calculating the number of birds. Just very rough estimates. And the basic bottom line is that, yes, there's a small impact, but the impact of the collectors in the 1800s, especially, still a little bit in the 1900s, is vastly less than the impact of modern society on birds. The number of birds being killed by cats today, even in a year or two, globally of course, is more than what was ever collected by these collectors. That kind of comparison is what she did. I don't remember the numbers, as well as birds flying into windows of houses or high-rise buildings and things like that. So the only thing that one can really say is that there may be a few species where the collectors did have an impact. And of course we know about the passenger pigeon that was shot to extinction. There it wasn't shooting for museums, it was hunting. It was hunting for food, they were very tasty, and it was just a sport, hunting for sport as well. So that can't quite be applied to what we're talking about here, people collecting birds for scientific discovery and naming new birds and seeing what's out there. There are maybe some island species or very, very rare species, but rare species weren't collected as much as common species. Of course, often the collectors were looking for birds they didn't know, but nevertheless, they wouldn't come across rare species as often. So the impact of collecting birds is not as bad as one might think. Even though lots of them, of course, were lost, just because they were poor specimens or eaten by insects on the way back to Europe and all those kinds of things. Yes?
Are any of the weavers local migrants within Africa?
Okay. Yeah, no. The red-billed quelea is a migrant bird. And so I coordinate the bird ringing scheme. And so I've got access to all this data on migration and movements. And we've got many quelea that have been ringed in South Africa and found as far north as Malawi and southern DRC. Although it's only a few records, but lots and lots up to Zimbabwe and Botswana. So they move regularly every year, we know this, also just from observations. They migrate away from South Africa and they come back again. Also in East Africa, they don't migrate from there to here, but within East Africa they migrate. Within West Africa, the red-billed quelea migrates. So the red-billed quelea is the longest distant migrant of all the weaver birds. Most weavers do not migrate and don't move that much. But the cardinal quelea and red-headed quelea also move, not to the same extent as the red-billed. The red-headed quelea moves up and down the coast from Mozambique to the Eastern Cape and back. So the queleas definitely migrate, and it's regular movements. Other weavers have local movements. Within Cape Town, I did a project on ringing as many weavers as possible and recapturing them, going to as many sites as possible from Kommetjie north up to Milnerton area, and showed that in an analysis that the Cape weaver moves quite a lot more than the southern masked weaver or red bishop or yellow bishop. But these are local movements. I've had two of my birds moving 50 kilometers. So one from Muizenberg was I recaptured, but had been ringed by someone else, the Tigerberg ringers in Coburg, and had flown all the way. So we know the Cape weavers, they breed around Cape Town, and they move out into the farmlands as far as Coburg and other places, and then come back to breed. They're also breeding in those places, but they just like foraging everywhere. But so most weavers, even in the rest of Africa, just have very local movements, some more than others, like the Cape weaver more than the southern masked weaver. But there are not too many migrants other than the quelea. Right, if there are no more questions, our time's just about up, so I'll see you tomorrow. Thank you. Okay.